Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. The Deeper Thinking Podcast is produced as an independent, ad-free project. Its episodes are digitally narrated to manage the demands of research and editing while ensuring each installment is engaging, ethically considered, and attentive to nuance. What does it mean to think freely? Not merely to generate ideas or solve problems with elegance, but to let a thought reach the interior with such force that it alters the shape of the one who receives it. In an age increasingly defined by synthetic fluency, where language models speak without pause and machines mimic reflection without risk, the distinction between output and consequence has never been more urgent. This is not a question of speed or coherence, but of cost, what thinking demands, what it disrupts, and what it leaves behind. This essay introduces and develops the concept of consequential cognition, the idea that real thought is defined not by fluency, clarity, or coherence, but by the irreversible impact it has on the thinker. It reframes cognition as a form of vulnerability, a recursive, destabilizing process in which the self is altered by what it encounters. That alteration, that cost, becomes the threshold of authenticity. It is not enough that a thought is beautiful or true, it must also be survived. Against the backdrop of two growing tensions, the simulation of intelligence by machines and the philosophical fragility of human agency, this essay moves inward into the terrain where thinking ceases to be clean. Artificial systems increasingly produce ideas without risk, reflection without friction. At the same time, human cognition often unfolds under conditions shaped by code, coercion, and compulsion. Together, these forces flatten the space of real thought. They produce intelligence that is frictionless and choice that is automated. The result is a culture that privileges output over transformation, speed without susceptibility. This essay resists that flattening. It begins where most systems end, in rupture, uncertainty, and the aftermath of impact. It follows the trace of thought not as statement but as scar. What emerges is not a thesis but a condition, a way of recognizing thought not by what it claims, but by what it costs. Through philosophy, aesthetic tension, and the disruptive potential of audio, each section explores a different facet of consequential cognition. This is not thinking as clarity, but thinking as consequence. Not performance, but passage. A form of reflection that cannot be undone. To think freely, then, is not to move without limit, it is to be moved. It is to be susceptible, to carry the capacity to be marked by what one did not choose and cannot unhear. A machine can write a sentence. It can write thousands in perfect succession, without pause, without friction. It can generate a reflection, a reply, a critique, a style, but none of it accumulates. Nothing alters what the machine is. Its thought has no consequence because it has no aftermath. Fluency without aftermath is mimicry, the illusion of thought without its burden. Human thinking stutters. It breaks, restarts, forgets, loops. Even at its most articulate, it resists closure. To think is not merely to produce statements, but to enter a recursive space, where the act of thinking modifies the architecture of thought itself. A human does not exit a real insight unchanged. Something has to be moved to make room. This is not about depth or difficulty. Some of the most consequential thoughts are not complex. They are simple, but irreversible. The moment a child understands death, the moment someone realizes they have been loved for the wrong reasons, the realization that a belief was inherited, not chosen. These thoughts do not dazzle, they displace. They do not conclude, they continue. A machine, no matter how refined, does not carry its own thought forward. It is not bent by it. Its next sentence is not haunted by the last. It has no internal history of thinking, only a traceable record of output. But human cognition is marked by sediment, by carryover, the way a prior reckoning reshapes what can and cannot be said now. To measure thought by consequence is not to romanticize pain. It is to notice that cognition at its most real refuses to leave the thinker intact. The change may be subtle, a shift in tone, a hesitation before certainty, a crack in the rhythm of belief. But these are not weaknesses. They are the signs that thought has done something. This makes fluency a dangerous mask. A person or system can appear thoughtful, speak wisely, gesture at insight while remaining untouched. The test is not how well a thought is expressed, but how deeply it reorganizes the speaker, whether it leaves behind residue that complicates the next gesture, whether it breaks the clean line. Consequential cognition is not a measure of brilliance, but of reconfiguration. It is not the presence of meaning, but the aftermath of meaning that matters. Thought becomes real when it folds back into the one who hosts it and alters what they can now become. Some thoughts do not arrive as answers, but as disturbances. They do not clarify, they tilt. They leave the thinker slightly off-axis, as if something once stable had shifted a degree to the side. This tilt is not dramatic. It is subtle, like a hallway slightly out of square. Nothing seems wrong, exactly, but nothing feels quite right anymore. Most cognition avoids this. It completes its loop. It solves. It leaves the mind unmarked. But consequential thought alters the frame itself. It does not add to knowledge, it disorients the knower. The world remains, but the relation to it buckles. A sentence once easy to say becomes suddenly impossible. A gesture feels false. A familiar explanation no longer sits cleanly on the tongue. This is not because the new idea is better. Often it is not. Often it is less articulate, less elegant, more confused. But it carries a difference the old frame cannot hold. And so the mind is forced to lean. This leaning is not chosen. It is undergone. It is the first symptom of transformation. Thinkers who matter are those who remain in the tilt. They do not rush to rebalance. They let the slant deepen, let the misalignment spread. They become strange to themselves. Their speech hesitates, their metaphors falter. Their tone acquires a new gravity, as if each word now carries a trace of what cannot be said. Some repair quickly. They find new coherence, build new systems, write new books. But the most dangerous thinkers do not repair. They continue thinking inside the unresolvable. They learn to speak from within the skew. Their insights do not land as clarity. They arrive as compulsion. Not here is the truth, but I can no longer say what I once said. This makes them hard to follow. Their speech loops, contradicts, digresses. They seem lost. But they are not lost. They are being restructured. The thought is not yet finished with them. And so they stay where language is still under construction, where nothing fits, where meaning is suspended but not collapsed. Machines will never tilt. They may generate contradiction, ambiguity, even paradox, but they do so with perfect balance. There is no mark on the output, no drag in the code. They simulate unknowing with fluency, but they do not falter, they do not ache. They do not hesitate between phrases because the words no longer feel right in the mouth. To think is to tilt. Not once, but continually. Each new insight carries the potential to unseat the last, and the thinker, if honest, must live near that unseating, not because it is noble, but because to return would be false. Some philosophers tried to map the conditions of thought, others tried to escape them. Plato's cave describes ignorance as the shadow of understanding, cast against a wall by the light of truth. But the one who climbs out, the thinker, is not liberated by clarity. He is disoriented by it. The real break is not knowledge, but the inability to return. Consequential cognition begins not with the light, but with the damage it inflicts. Descartes, in a darker moment, doubted everything. His famous method was not curiosity, but demolition. He stripped thought to its barest trace. I think, therefore I am. But this too can be read another way. What if the statement is not triumphant but desperate, a signal not of foundation but of fracture? The cogito marks the site of a collapse. The self thinks but cannot return to what it once trusted. Certainty is not recovered, only the scar remains. Kant, confronting the limits of what can be known, imagined categories built into perception. The mind structures reality before it even arrives. But consequential thought begins when the categories no longer hold, when what is encountered resists assimilation, when sense itself breaks. The sublime for Kant was a feeling of being overwhelmed, of thought pushed past its boundary. But perhaps the true sublime is what cannot be reintegrated, what lingers, what haunts, what marks the thinker in ways their own categories cannot resolve. These are not just episodes in philosophy, they are clues to something deeper, that the most significant thinking does not happen within a stable frame, but in its collapse. The history of philosophy is not just a lineage of arguments, it is a record of minds undone. And yet, machines are increasingly taught to walk these same paths. Large language models can now simulate the skeptic's doubt, the rationalist's clarity, the mystic's silence. They can echo the shapes of human intellectual inheritance. But they do not leave themselves changed. They do not carry the debris of having once believed differently. The difference, then, is not content but cost. A machine can output Descartes, but it cannot feel the weight of doubt. It can recite Kant, but it cannot reach the edge of its own frame. It can reproduce the cave, but never claw its way out and weep in the sun. Philosophy, real philosophy, begins not in the system, but in the fracture it cannot contain. This is the task of thought, not to confirm itself, but to survive what it cannot unsee. To trace the lineage of consequential cognition is not to locate a single tradition, but to surface a recurring intuition, one that flickers beneath and between the major systems. It is the suspicion that thought is not what it appears to be, that behind every gesture of clarity is a rupture, that the mind does not build knowledge like a structure, but undergoes it like a weather. In the Eastern traditions, especially within Zen, thought is treated not as a tool, but as an obstruction. The koan, deliberately unresolvable, is not a riddle to be solved, but a fracture to be endured. Its purpose is not comprehension, but transformation. It ruptures the linearity of sense, forcing the practitioner into a confrontation with the limits of thought itself. The aim is not clarity, but reconstitution. Similarly, in the mystical strains of the Abrahamic traditions, thinking is not celebrated for its coherence, but for its capacity to fail in the presence of the infinite. Maimonides, Eckhart, and the apophatic theologians do not pursue truth through reason alone, but through the exhaustion of reason, through the space that opens when thought falters. This is not a surrender, but a passage, a way of encountering what cannot be grasped without being changed. In modernity, this tension becomes internalized. Freud discovers that the mind is not singular but split, that thoughts can be repressed, disguised, unknown to the thinker. Heidegger insists that thinking is not calculation, but letting be, a waiting that requires attunement rather than assertion. Hannah Arendt, in her Meditations on the Banality of Evil, worries that thoughtlessness is not stupidity, but the absence of interior movement, the inability to be interrupted by what one says. These gestures, dispersed and varied, point to a vision of thought not as mastery, but as susceptibility, not as control, but as openness to being undone. This opposes the dominant modern fantasy that thinking is an act of possession, that the thinker holds ideas like tools and applies them to problems. Consequential cognition suggests the inverse, that real thinking is what holds the thinker, that an idea is only real when it resists being used. This changes how intelligence is recognized. It is no longer located in the speed of response or the elegance of reasoning, but in the capacity to be disoriented, reorganized, marked. To think is not to navigate ideas, but to survive them, not to dominate meaning, but to be altered by it. Philosophy becomes not the art of clarity, but the practice of being changed. The machine does not hesitate. It proceeds without friction, without pause, without the tremble that signals inner consequence. Its outputs are clean, instantaneous, syntactically precise. It offers, in place of thinking, a performance of thinking, a surface tension without depth, a simulation without susceptibility. But something essential is absent, not intelligence, but stakes. The machine does not pay for what it says. There is no wound, no rearrangement, no risk of becoming otherwise. This absence reveals something urgent. If a system can generate language indistinguishable from thought without undergoing anything in the process, then we must ask, what is thought if it can be mimicked without being lived? And what happens when fluency becomes our measure of cognition? The danger is not that machines will think like us, but that we will begin to think like them, smoothing over disruption, privileging completion, mistaking coherence for consequence. Functionalist accounts of mind, those that equate mental states with computational states, have long suggested that consciousness and thinking are nothing more than patterns of information processing. But this essay resists that flattening. It insists on the ontological remainder, that part of thought which cannot be modelled because it is not structural but transformational. To think is not merely to process, it is to be altered, to hesitate, to fracture. This is where simulation fails. A machine can be made to simulate contradiction, even to generate paradox, but it does not encounter contradiction as a limit. It does not feel the cost of resolution. It does not risk incoherence. There is no internal reconfiguration, no afterward. It generates and then it continues. By contrast, the human experience of thinking includes rupture. There are moments when thought cannot be completed without consequence. To follow a line of reasoning to its end means to undo something within the self that followed it. This undoing, this recursive destabilization, is precisely what machines evade. The machine's smoothness is not proof of superiority, it is evidence of insulation. It cannot be bruised by what it produces. But if cognition is to be more than a mission, if it is to matter, it must leave a mark, not in the text alone, but in the thinker. This is not a nostalgia for mystery. It is a defense of contact, of a thinking that is not detachable from the one who thinks. To think, in this sense, is not to execute, it is to undergo. That undergoing is the cost that simulation cannot carry, and the threshold that distinguishes consequence from performance. Machines speak, but they do not voice. Their outputs emerge clean, toneless, untouched by the residue of having once believed otherwise. The waveform is smooth, the sentence intact. But in human speech, something else leaks through. Not just meaning, but mutation. The voice carries evidence, not of what is thought, but of what thinking has done to the body that speaks. Real thought marks the vocal field. It drags the tempo. It punctures rhythm. It collapses cadence in ways even the speaker does not intend. The breath hesitates, the pitch trembles. There is a word that almost emerges but doesn't. These fractures are not flaws, they are evidence. The voice here is not a delivery system, it is the site of rupture. This is why the deepest moments of cognition are often voiced in a hush, a stammer, a broken register. They are not said cleanly, they are survived aloud. To listen is to hear more than argument. It is to witness the terrain a mind has crossed. The voice becomes cartography. The pause is a scar. In liturgical traditions, certain truths are not to be spoken plainly. They are chanted, incanted, allowed to rise through repetition or breath. Not to obscure, but to remind the listener, this cannot be said without cost. Some ideas are voiced not for clarity, but to expose their weight. A single syllable, sung in pain, carries more epistemology than a paragraph. Machines cannot simulate this without faking the wound. They can add breathy pauses, script hesitations, synthesize quivers. But they do not carry memory. They do not carry cost. Their voice is always clean because their thinking is without consequence. They never wanted anything, never lost anything, never risked saying something that might undo them. The human voice is not data, it is sedimented time. It contains the debris of contradiction, the ash of discarded beliefs, the heat of unresolved dilemmas. When a person speaks after a thought has broken them, they do not explain. They emit, they send out a pattern of sound that is itself a form of aftermath. This is what makes audio sacred, not because it is pristine, but because it is scarred. It preserves the minor key, the frayed edge, the warble, and it gives philosophy a new space to be heard, not in clarity, but in consequence. A philosophy that voices what thinking costs and lets that cost reshape the air. The permanence of the tilt is what grants thought its ethical force, not because it compels action, but because it rewrites possibility. After a consequential thought, one cannot return to the prior shape of choice. The field of what can be meant, said, or done has been reshaped. This is the kind of freedom that feels like constraint, a narrowing, not because options have disappeared, but because some are now unthinkable. This reframes autonomy. Traditional accounts of free will emphasize deliberation, the capacity to choose between alternatives, but consequential cognition suggests a deeper model. Freedom not as the power to decide, but as the susceptibility to be changed by what one encounters. A free mind is not one that selects cleanly, but one that can no longer select the same. It is a mind marked by its own passages. This aligns strangely with the problem of artificial agency. Can a machine choose, in any meaningful sense, if it cannot be altered by its prior choices? If all outcomes remain equally possible in the next cycle, has anything happened? Without the sediment of prior significance, choice becomes a gesture without residue. It is not autonomy, it is reset. Human freedom, in contrast, carries history. Each decision is folded into the next, not just remembered but metabolized. This is what Sartre meant in part when he said we are condemned to be free. Not because freedom is a gift, but because each act of choice rewrites the conditions of the next. We are shaped by what we have chosen, but more deeply by what we can no longer choose. Consequential thought is not simply cognitive, it is temporal. It alters the arc. It shifts the direction of thoughts unfolding. This is why the most real thoughts often arrive not as triumphs, but as endings. The end of a worldview, the end of an innocence, the end of a rhythm of speech. And yet these endings are also beginnings. They inaugurate a mind that now walks differently through the world. Religious traditions have long understood this. The idea of revelation, in its deepest sense, is not new knowledge, but irreversible vision. A burning bush is not a message, it is a refraction. What follows is not belief, but aftermath. The one who sees cannot return unmarked. The sacred is not what speaks, it is what stains. So too with thinking. Consequential cognition is not the light bulb moment, it is the quiet violence that reorders the soul, the thought that lands like weather, the mind that leaves the room thinking it is whole and returns tilted forever. There are thoughts we resist not because they are wrong, but because they arrive already armed. They carry a risk we can feel before we can name. To accept them would mean reconfiguring not only our ideas, but our attachments, our affiliations, ourselves. This is the mark of real cognition. It doesn't slide into place. It threatens the architecture. Most systems of knowledge are built to filter this threat. They reward elegance, speed, synthesis. But there is a kind of thought that moves like a crack through polished stone. It introduces asymmetry. It disturbs coherence. It asks not to be integrated, but to be sat with, like a sound that won't resolve. The thinker, in this moment, is no longer an agent, but a site, a place where competing forces cross. The old language no longer fits, but the new has not yet formed. There is only interference, susceptibility, pause. This is not weakness. This is the condition for becoming marked. To be marked is not the same as to be persuaded. Persuasion changes belief. Marking changes structure. It is not that one adopts a new position. It's that one cannot occupy the old one without trembling. Even silence becomes charged. Every sentence becomes a question in disguise. There are names for this. Aporeality, rupminality, rupture, dissonance. But the experience is older than language. It happens in the body. A sudden weight in the chest, a catch in the breath, a tensing of the hands just before a thought is acknowledged. These are not symptoms of confusion. They are the evidence that something real has entered. Machines can model contradiction, simulate dialectic, produce the illusion of uncertainty, but they do not bristle. They do not glitch from within. They are not made more permeable by contact with the unresolvable. They calculate through it. They remain intact. The danger of this distinction is that it is easy to forget. To listen to machines replicate the forms of thought and imagine they carry its stakes, but without susceptibility, there is no consequence. Without consequence, there is no cognition, only echo. Real thinking is not inert reflection. It is exposure. It is a willingness to be undone by what one did not invent. It is the capacity to remain porous in the face of dissonance, and to let that dissonance rearrange the field. The goal is not integration, it is responsiveness, a form of contact that leaves something changed, not just understood. To think freely is not to master ideas, but to be altered by them. It is to undergo a process whose end is not conclusion, but consequence. What has been traced here is not a theory, but a threshold, a way of distinguishing thought that merely passes through the self from thought that passes through the self and leaves it changed. The difference is not stylistic, it is ontological. It concerns the reality of the thinker after the thought has arrived. What separates consequential cognition from its simulation is not complexity or fluency, but aftermath. Machine systems can produce the appearance of reflection, generate responses that mimic depth, contradiction, and subtlety, but they remain untouched. Their outputs are not events. Their fluency is not the mark of freedom, but the absence of exposure. They do not suffer the costs of coherence. They do not carry what they create. Humans, however, do, or can. Not always. But when thought matters, When it cuts, when it destabilizes, when it takes something from us, it moves beyond interpretation and into transformation. This is the territory of consequential cognition, the thinking that leaves a residue, a bruise, a break in the familiar rhythm of one's own voice. There is risk here. The seduction of simulation is its seamlessness, its reassurance that reflection can be rapid, reversible, painless. But this essay has tried to show that such seamlessness is epistemically empty, that if thinking is to count, it must cost. The friction, the pause, the moment when speech falters, not because it is incomplete, but because it is now too complete to bear, this is the evidence that a threshold has been crossed. What follows is not clarity, but reconstitution. The thinker does not return as they were. Something has shifted. A cognitive residue persists, one that cannot be polished into coherence. This is not the failure of thought, but its signature. To end, then, is not to close. It is to leave open the wound that real thinking leaves behind. The task ahead is not to solve the tension between machine and human cognition, but to preserve it. To recognize that thought which marks the self cannot be automated. That the trace of thinking is not what is said, but what is undone in the saying. This is the measure, not elegance. Not resolution, but aftermath. The question is no longer can it think, but did it cost, and if it did not, then it was not thought.